June 6, 1978. Jericho, Vermont. Michael Reapp, the husband of 32-year-old Grace Reapp, claims that he returned home from work and discovered that Grace and their 5-year-old daughter, Gracie Reapp, had disappeared, though he believes they ran off voluntarily. 18 years later, Michael himself goes missing after police announced that Grace and Gracie's disappearances have become a homicide investigation and a search is being performed at their former property. While Michael is eventually indicted for their murders, he is killed before he can be arrested, so no trace of Grace or Gracie is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and today we're going to be exploring a missing persons case involving a mother and daughter, the 1978 disappearances of Grace and Gracie Reapp. This one was suggested to me several years ago by a listener named Emily, and the story has a number of surprising twists and turns. At the time she went missing, Grace Reapp was living in Vermont with her husband Michael Reapp and their 3 children, but even though the couple's 2 sons were left behind, Grace and her 5-year-old daughter Gracie disappeared simultaneously. For the longest time, Michael pushed forward the narrative that Grace and Gracie ran away together, so it would be years before a proper police investigation was performed, and their disappearances didn't receive any media coverage at all until 1996. However, things really went off the rails when Michael himself disappeared, and while he was not initially charged with any crime, there was speculation that he was motivated to run off because law enforcement was taking a fresh look at the case and digging around his former property. While Grace and Gracie's remains were never found, investigators eventually reached the point where they felt that the evidence was strong enough to indict Michael for their murders, but he was killed before he could be taken into custody and go on trial. On the surface, it might seem obvious what happened here, but until Grace and Gracie can be recovered, this will always remain an open and active investigation, and there are still a ton of unanswered questions about what happened, as Michael's side of the family would experience another shocking event which may or may not have a connection to this case. But I'll be sharing the full details as we go along. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearances of Grace and Gracie Reapp. Our story begins in 1978 in Jericho, Vermont, a small town located in Chittenden County which had a population of around 3,500 at that time. Our 2 victims are 32-year-old Grace Marie Canto Reapp and her 5-year-old daughter, Grace Noel Reapp, who goes by the nickname Gracie. Gracie originally hails from Fall River, Massachusetts, and experienced a lot of tragedy in her life as she lost her father, Manuel Canto, in 1959 when she was still a teenager. And even though her mother Philomena got remarried to a man named Ernest Byron, he wound up passing away in March of 1968. For the past 13 years, Grace has been married to her 32-year-old husband, Michael Reapp, whom she met in Stonington, Connecticut when he was a cadet in the United States Coast Guard Academy. In addition to Gracie, the couple now have 2 sons, 11-year-old Brian and 7-year-old Patrick. After Michael served in Vietnam, the family relocated from Connecticut to Jericho, and for the past 3 years, they have resided on a 10-acre plot of land located in a rural area on Hanley Lane. Michael works as an air traffic controller at Burlington International Airport, but on June the 6th, he claimed that he returned home from work and discovered that Grace and Gracie were gone, as Grace had supposedly left a note taped to the medicine chest in which she wrote that she and Gracie had left voluntarily and had no plans to return. According to Michael, their 2 sons, Brian and Patrick, had been attending their last day at Jericho Elementary School when their mother and sister took off. They would both later confirm that they last saw their mother when she put them on the school bus that morning. When they returned home hours later, their father initially informed them that Grace and Gracie had left on a little vacation, though he later told them that they were not coming back. However, when Grace's sister Juliana phoned the residence a short time later to thank Grace for a gift she had recently received, Michael told her that Grace was out. But when Juliana phoned again 3 days later, she was shocked to hear Michael finally reveal that Grace and Gracie had run away. He also did not contact the Jericho Police Department to officially report them missing until June the 11th, 5 days after they were last seen. Michael shared the same story about returning home and finding a note from Grace in which she stated she was running off with Gracie, but when asked to produce this note, Michael claimed that he had lost it. On June the 16th, 5 days after Grace and Gracie were reported missing, and 10 days after he last saw them, Michael filed for divorce from Grace and cited desertion and intolerable severity as the reasons for the dissolution of the marriage, and at the time, Vermont law described intolerable severity as a threat to life, limb, or the health of a spouse. Well, Grace's family had a hard time believing that she disappeared voluntarily, as they felt she never would have abandoned her 2 sons and broken off all contact with them. Since Grace hailed from a Portuguese family, Michael told some of his neighbors that it was a common cultural thing for Portuguese mothers to stick with their daughters while fathers stuck with their sons, which would have explained why Grace took off with Gracie and left Brian and Patrick behind. The investigation wound up in the hands of the Vermont State Police, and while they re-interviewed Michael, they did not initially treat the case with much urgency. In August of that year, Juliana put an ad in the classified section of the Burlington Free Press asking Grace to get in touch with her, but the newspaper refused to run photos of Grace and Gracie because the Vermont State Police declined to say that the disappearances were suspicious. In spite of this, Grace's family were concerned about her safety, as even though they had never personally seen Michael get violent with Grace and she never openly accused him of beating her, they suspected he was abusive. At one point, Grace's mother, Philomena Canto Byron, had seen her daughter with a black eye, but Grace never filed a domestic abuse complaint or breached the topic with her own family. Some of Michael's co-workers at Burlington International Airport also claimed that he often called his wife a quote-unquote fat bitch and complained that he had been forced to leave the Coast Guard Academy because she got pregnant with their first child. Michael also had a tendency to unnerve his co-workers by showing them a photo album from his time in Vietnam which contained photos of horribly mutilated corpses. In November of 1977, 7 months before Grace and Gracie went missing, Michael himself had disappeared without explanation, and he later sent Grace a letter claiming he had joined the CIA and was doing undercover work for them. But 1 week after the letter was sent, Michael phoned Grace while crying and begged for a chance to return home. Grace agreed to take him back, and Michael's employer informed him that he would need to get counseling if he wanted to remain as an air traffic controller. After Grace vanished, Michael would frequently write and send letters to her family, and in December of 1978, they received one in which Michael confessed that he had cheated on Grace several times during their marriage, and at the time she went missing, he had been conducting an extramarital affair with 26-year-old Donna Rusin, who worked as a car rental clerk at Burlington International Airport and would often babysit his children. In one letter that Michael wrote to Grace's family, he pushed forward the possibility that she was having an affair with another man and ran off with him, and the reason she took Gracie along and not Brian and Patrick is because the 2 boys were old enough to realize that the affair was quote-unquote wrong. By July of 1979, Grace had still not resurfaced and never appeared at any of the divorce hearings, while Michael's attorney reported that, quote-unquote, due diligence had been used to find her by inquiry of her relatives and of persons who might know where she is, but with no results. In the end, the divorce wound up being granted, and Michael was given custody of Brian and Patrick, though he said he would agree to allow Grace to retain custody of Gracie. 4 months later, Michael got married to Donna Rusin, who moved into his residence. In 1981, Michael wound up losing his job during the infamous Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization strike, where thousands of air traffic controllers walked off the job to demand higher wages and more benefits. The administration of President Ronald Reagan soon ordered these controllers to return to work, but most of them, including Michael, did not, and ended up being fired and replaced. In May of 1983, Michael decided to relocate from Vermont to Florida with his wife and 2 sons, but he got divorced from Donna 2 years later. He continued to periodically send letters to Grace's family to express his belief that his ex-wife and daughter were still alive somewhere, even though there was no activity on Grace's bank accounts, credit cards, or her social security number. In one letter, Michael said he had talked to a psychiatrist who once again pushed forward the idea that Grace may have been seeing another man during their marriage, and due to her strict religious beliefs, she ran away to hide her shame and broke off all contact with her own family. Regardless, Michael said he hoped that once Gracie became old enough, she would attempt to reach out and contact him. By this point, Grace's sister Juliana had gotten married and was going under the surname Woodworth, and she had also gotten a job as a dispatcher for the police department in Groton, Connecticut, and would frequently spend her time there looking for news about unidentified bodies in hopes that there might be a connection to Grace and Gracie. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with the Bear Brook murders, where a 55-gallon drum was found in Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, which contained the bodies of an unidentified murdered adult woman and a young girl in November of 1985. When Juliana first learned about this, she wondered if the victims might have been Grace and Gracie, but dental records ruled this possibility out. I won't share the full story of the Bear Brook murders since it's a major rabbit hole, but long story short, DNA profiling and genetic genealogy finally helped identify the 2 victims as 24-year-old Marlies Honeychurch and 7-year-old Marie Vaughn in 2019. At one point, Grace's mother, Philomena Canto Byron, was contacted by Michael's mother, Jessie Waugh, who asked for a photograph of Gracie since she did not have one. To Philomena's surprise, she learned that Michael had told his mother that Grace and Gracie were living in Connecticut with relatives from their side of the family, which turned out not to be true. Well, for nearly a decade, Grace's family had no luck convincing law enforcement to perform a proper investigation, but during the summer of 1987, Juliana received a phone call from Sergeant William Northrup, a detective from the Vermont State Police. Northrup believed that the police had mishandled the original investigation, so he asked Juliana for permission to formally reopen the case, and she gladly agreed. Of course, by this point, Michael and his 2 sons had moved to Florida, but law enforcement finally performed some searches at his former property in Jericho. One of these searches was brought on after a witness recalled having seen Michael digging a hole on the property years earlier, but no evidence was found. In 1989, Juliana contacted Unsolved Mysteries to inquire about featuring Grace and Gracie's disappearances on the show, but they weren't interested. And on Thanksgiving Day of that year, Michael and Grace's son Brian, who was 22 years old by this point, agreed to meet up with Juliana in an empty motel conference room in Florida to discuss the case. Even though Brian had always believed his father's story that Grace and Gracie ran away voluntarily, Juliana now told him that she believed they were both deceased. So now I'm going to share some details about a side story involving Michael's side of the family. Michael's father, Benjamin Reapp, had divorced his mother when he was very young and soon got remarried to Michael's stepmother, Wanda Reapp. By 1988, Benjamin was 62 years old and Wanda was 52, and the couple had been married for nearly 30 years and were living together in Melbourne, Florida. At around 9 p.m. on the evening of August the 26th, Benjamin claimed that they went to a Mr. Donut shop in the town of Cocoa, and he went inside to purchase some donuts while Wanda remained in the car. When Benjamin came back outside, he said he was accosted by a black man who appeared to be in his 30s, who asked for a ride, and when Benjamin turned him down, the man pulled out a small caliber handgun and ordered him to climb into his car. He then forced the couple to drive 8 miles to an isolated wooded area and in the unincorporated community of Canaveral Groves, where he stole a few $100s from them. Benjamin then said that the man tied him up and forced him to watch him sexually assault Wanda before he was knocked out with a blow to the head. When Benjamin regained consciousness, he said he saw Wanda driving the car away at gunpoint with the black man sitting next to her. Benjamin then got up and ran to the nearest house about a mile away, where the resident untied him and called 911 for help. An hour and a half later, the Brevard County Sheriff's Office found Wanda's body floating in a drainage ditch about a half-mile south from the location where Benjamin said he had been tied up. The Reapp's stolen car was soon found abandoned in Cocoa, less than 2 blocks away from the Mr. Donut shop where the initial abduction had taken place. The autopsy revealed that Wanda had been battered before she died of asphyxiation. A composite sketch for the black suspect was created and circulated through Brevard County, but he could not be identified or found. And, well, we'll get back to this part of the story later on and reveal how it fits in with our featured case. The investigation into Grace and Gracie's disappearance would be rejuvenated in 1996, though it took a tragic event for this to happen. Grace and Michael's youngest son Patrick had since enlisted in the military and was serving in Germany, but on May the 26th of that year, he died of a heart ailment brought on by complications from the flu at the age of 25. By this point, Patrick's brother Brian was living in Marathon, Florida with his wife and 3 children. Michael was also living in Florida in the town of Jupiter, and since divorcing Donna Rusin in 1985, he had since gotten remarried for the 3rd time. However, it turned out that Michael's relationship with Donna was quite troubled as well. Before Grace and Gracie went missing, Michael had been carrying on an extramarital affair with Donna, and she got pregnant, so Michael made her get an abortion. After they got married, Donna became the victim of frequent abuse and claimed there was one incident where Michael had his hand around her throat and declared, quote, "Yeah, it's me, I'm back, and I'm your worst nightmare," end quote. During another altercation, Michael reportedly told Donna that she, quote-unquote, did not physically fight back like Grace. The big breaking point which led to the divorce was an incident where Michael beat up Donna, and she felt that she may have been killed if some of her relatives had not stepped in to stop him. In September of 1996, investigators from the Vermont State Police traveled to Jupiter to re-interview Michael, who continued to stand by his belief that Grace and Gracie disappeared voluntarily and were still alive somewhere. Well, in October of that year, both the state police and the FBI worked together to perform an all-new 3-day search of the Reapp's former 10-acre property in Jericho, which involved using cadaver dogs and excavation equipment. It turned out that in October of 1979, Michael had filed for a permit to fill the garage under his home in order to make room for a new living space and a second garage. Even though ground-penetrating radar was used on this location and a dig was performed, no evidence was found beneath the garage. Regardless, even though the Vermont State Police seemed inclined to believe that Grace and Gracie's remains were not on the property and did not name anyone as a suspect or person of interest, they formally reclassified the 2 victims' disappearances as a homicide investigation. Well, on November the 13th, the story took a surprising turn when Brian Reapp contacted the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office in order to report his father missing. Michael was last seen by his wife on October the 26th when he left their home in his 1994 Isuzu pickup truck, but he never returned home, and even though the only items he appeared to take along with him were his toothbrush and a pack of cigarettes, his wife did not attempt to report him missing, and Brian did so instead 2.5 weeks later. When the Vermont State Police interviewed Michael 2 months earlier, they never told him that they were planning to perform a search of his former property in Jericho. But on October the 22nd, a Burlington-based reporter had called Michael at his home to interview him and told him about the search, which may have prompted Michael's decision to run away. During one interview, Brian told the media that he did not expect to ever see his father again, stating, quote, "I always thought my dad was innocent until he took off like he did," end quote. Investigators learned that in the days after he left Florida, Michael made a withdrawal from an ATM in New Orleans, Louisiana. On December the 4th, a parking attendant at New Orleans International Airport contacted the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office to report an abandoned Isuzu pickup truck which had been parked on the lot for over a month, and it turned out to be Michael's. Michael himself could not be found, but since he was known for being an avid sailor, there was speculation that he may have used a boat to flee to Mexico or the Caribbean. By 2001, the police had searched the Reapp's former property in Jericho at least 4 times and found nothing, but Juliana continued to remain convinced that Grace and Gracie's remains were there, and she even brought a psychic to the site who expressed her belief that they were still on the property somewhere. Well, for the next several years, Michael, Grace, and Gracie all continued to remain missing persons, and while Michael was considered to be a person of interest in his wife and daughter's disappearances, he was never charged with any crime and was only wanted for questioning. However, on June the 22nd, 2006, the Vermont State Police formally announced that Michael had been indicted for first-degree murder in connection to Grace's disappearance and second-degree murder in connection to Gracie's disappearance, so a warrant was issued for his arrest. Of course, Grace and Gracie's remains had still not been found, but the authorities had presented what they considered to be a very compelling circumstantial case to Chittenden County prosecutors and a judge who agreed to file charges. One of the biggest issues with Michael was that he repeatedly changed his version of events and could not maintain a consistent story. For instance, when he was re-interviewed in 1996, Michael claimed that he discovered Grace and Gracie were missing when he returned home from working the overnight shift on the morning of June the 7th, 1978, even though he originally claimed that he found them missing on June the 6th. Well, sure enough, when investigators checked with the FAA, they were able to confirm that Michael had called in sick to Burlington International Airport on June the 6th. And while Michael had said that he could not remember whether or not he worked on the days following his wife and daughter's disappearances, FAA records showed that he did not actually return to his job until June the 13th. Investigators expressed their belief that Michael killed Grace because she found out about his extramarital affair with Donna Rusin and got into an altercation, and then he proceeded to kill Gracie because she happened to be a witness to her mother's murder. At the time these indictments were handed down, Michael had not been seen in nearly 10 years, so he became a fugitive and was profiled on America's Most Wanted a few weeks later. Well, on June the 23rd, 2010, one day following the 4-year anniversary of Michael's indictment, the authorities would announce a very unexpected resolution. It turned out that after abandoning his pickup truck in New Orleans, Michael had somehow traveled to Yuma County, Arizona, and on January the 10th, 1997, he apparently made a failed attempt across the border into Mexico. He then attempted to abduct and carjack a man at gunpoint from the Two Rivers feed store, but as they were speeding away, the hostage managed to escape and contacted the authorities. A high-speed chase would ensue on U.S. Route 30, which involved the Yuma County Sheriff's Office and the Border Patrol, and they wound up forcing Michael and his stolen car off the road near the Avenue 31 overpass near the town of Welton. However, before Michael could be captured, he fatally shot himself in the head, and he was 51 years old at the time of his death. Since Michael was not carrying any identification, no one could figure out who he was. While his fingerprints were entered into a national criminal database in 1997, Michael had not yet been arrested or charged with any crime, so he was not listed there. As a result, he remained an unidentified John Doe and was buried in an unmarked grave for the next 13 years. In 2010, the son of Juliana Woodworth thought he had seen a man who looked like Michael sitting inside a vehicle on a ferry which was crossing Lake Champlain in Vermont, so he called an FBI agent he knew with the man's description and license number. While this guy didn't turn out to be Michael, it compelled the FBI to perform another cross-referencing of their fingerprint databases. Well, by this point, Michael had been indicted for 2 murders, so his prints were finally in the system, and they wound up matching the John Doe from Yuma County. While Grace and Gracie's loved ones were happy to learn that Michael was no longer a free man, the whole situation was a bittersweet feeling for them, since he never revealed the location of the 2 victims' remains. Over the past 4 decades, over 25 digs have been performed at the Reapp's former property in Jericho, as well as the surrounding wooded area, but since Grace and Gracie have never been found, this will remain an open and active investigation until the remains can be recovered. In September of 2012, Grace's mother, Philomena Canto Byron, passed away at the age of 101 without receiving any conclusive answers about what happened to her daughter and granddaughter. But there's one final postscript to this story. Remember the 1988 murder of Michael's stepmother, Wanda Reapp? Well, it remained unsolved for nearly 25 years, but on April the 30th, 2013, a Brevard County grand jury indicted her former husband and Michael's father, Benjamin Reapp, on the charge of first-degree premeditated murder in relation to her death. At this particular point, Benjamin was 87 years old and in the midst of serving a 3-year prison sentence after he was convicted on the charge of lewd and lascivious behavior against a child under the age of 12 in 2010. Benjamin's conviction had compelled the Brevard County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit to take a fresh look at Wanda's murder, and while the specifics are vague, they realized that there were a number of troubling and inconsistent details from Benjamin's original statements in 1988, which weren't picked up on at the time. And while no details were shared publicly, investigators also said that they had physical evidence implicating Benjamin in his wife's murder. So as you might have guessed, this so-called black man who kidnapped the couple and murdered Wanda did not actually exist, and Benjamin had apparently staged the whole thing. As far as the motive for the crime, investigators said it was financial gain, but Benjamin never admitted any culpability. I wish we had learned more details about this crime when Benjamin stood trial, but on July the 5th, just over 2 months after the indictment, he died of natural causes while receiving medical care at the Reception and Medical Center in Lake Butler. This meant that the case was officially closed, but interestingly enough, Joe Martin, the lead agent on the case, told the press that he always believed that someone else was involved in Wanda's murder, as Benjamin apparently spoke to a prosecution witness about this. And well, given that the apple apparently didn't fall far from the tree in the Reapp family, I'll be talking more about this angle later on. But unfortunately, after more than 47 years, Grace and Gracie Reapp continue to remain missing persons. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So obviously, this one will not be classified as one of the more baffling and mysterious cases ever featured on The Trail Went Cold, but what separates this story from many others is that we have a prime suspect who was actually indicted for the victim's murders, but he died before he could be arrested and stand trial. This is very reminiscent of the episode I released last month about the 1989 disappearance of Pam Page, as her husband, Rob Page, remained the prime suspect for a long time until he died of cancer, but years after Rob's death, the local attorney's office sent Pam's family a letter in which they revealed that they had reopened the investigation, and based on the new evidence they collected, they believed that they would have been able to charge Rob with Pam's murder if he had still been alive at that point. However, while the investigation into Pam's disappearance is considered to be closed, her family will still not rest until her remains can be recovered, and the same logic applies to Grace and Gracie Reapp's loved ones. In this case, the authorities indicted Michael Reapp on 2 counts of murder, but were not yet aware that he was already deceased. The case against Michael was very circumstantial, as there were no bodies or any direct physical evidence of foul play, but the authorities felt he made enough incriminating and contradictory statements that they would have been able to convince a jury to vote guilty if Michael had been brought to trial. Murder convictions without bodies are becoming more and more common these days, but without knowing the full extent of the evidence against Michael, it's hard to predict if he would have been convicted if he had gone on trial back in 2006. Unfortunately, this is one of those cases in which things might have turned out differently if a proper investigation had been performed right from the outset, but we're talking about 1978, when law enforcement was a lot more inclined to believe that missing people just ran away voluntarily unless there was conclusive evidence of foul play. For nearly a decade, it sounds like the Vermont State Police just pretty much took Michael at his word that Grace and Gracie left on their own, even though there was no paper trail for either of them, and it seemed very out of character for Grace to abandon her 2 sons. It was Grace's sister, Juliana Woodworth, who would not let the case die until it finally wound up in the hands of competent investigators. Of course, when I first learned about this case, it did appear that Michael was the guilty party, but what I initially did not understand is why he would make his 5-year-old daughter disappear, yet not harm his 8-year-old and 11-year-old sons. Well, the theory presented by the authorities is that since Michael seemed to have an extensive history of physical abuse and had beat Grace on a number of occasions, they may have gotten into a heated argument, possibly over Grace learning about his extramarital affair with Donna Rusin, and while Michael may not have planned on killing his wife, he could have done so in a fit of rage. And since Gracie just happened to be there at the time, Michael felt he had to kill her as well because she was a witness, which, if accurate, is truly reprehensible. But as cold-blooded as that scenario sounds, it would make sense, because it appears like the 2 boys, Brian and Patrick, were at school when the crime took place, as they claim that Grace and Gracie were already gone by the time they arrived home. But if Brian and Patrick had been around to witness their father kill their mother, they may have wound up suffering the same fate. It is sad to read interviews with Brian about the whole situation, because it sounds like he actually did have a good relationship with Michael, as he once stated, quote, "He was an excellent father, which is really making it that much hard on me. It was always a matter of him talking to me, not hitting or beating me." End quote. While Brian said he had flashbacks of his parents arguing with each other, he always maintained that he never saw his father become physically violent with his mother, though it seems pretty clear-cut that there was abuse in the marriage. Even though Grace's mother once saw her with a black eye, Grace still refused to acknowledge that Michael had hit her because back during the 1970s, there was a much more taboo attitude towards domestic violence, and some battered spouses just would not talk about it. Brian also said that he seemed to develop a closer relationship with his father after his mother and sister disappeared, as Michael seemed to go out of his way to spend more time with him and his brother Patrick, though this may have been the result of some sort of subconscious guilt over the fact that he murdered their sister. Brian said that he didn't have any reason to disbelieve Michael's claims that Grace and Gracie left on their own until his Aunt Juliana told him about Michael's darker side over 10 years later. And of course, when Michael ran away in 1996, after the disappearances were reclassified as a homicide investigation, Brian said he couldn't delude himself into believing that his father was innocent. But I gotta say, Brian has to be one of the most tragic figures ever featured on The Trail Went Cold. Not only did his father likely murder his mother and sister, but his paternal grandfather would later get charged with murdering his step-grandmother, and he also lost his brother Patrick at the young age of 25. If that wasn't enough, Brian also lost his wife, Lucinda Reapp, at the age of 34. In December of 2003, a man named Michael Rose took Lucinda for a ride on the back of his motorcycle, but since he was intoxicated at the time, Rose wound up crashing the bike, and Lucinda was killed after she was propelled into oncoming traffic and hit by a pickup truck. Rose was charged with DUI manslaughter, and after he was found guilty at trial, he received a 15-year prison sentence. So it's good to see that Brian received some semblance of justice for at least one tragedy in his life, and I hope he is doing well today. So it sounds like Michael had quite a violent temper, but it also appears that his service in Vietnam may have left him with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is why he made such inexplicable decisions, such as running out on Grace because he claimed he was working with the CIA. In spite of his issues, Michael was described as being a very intelligent person, which is probably why he was able to work the high-stress job as an air traffic controller. I mentioned earlier that Michael lost his job during the infamous Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization strike, but if you do a search on Michael Reapp's name at newspapers.com, you'll actually find his photograph on the front page of the August 6, 1981 edition of the Burlington Free Press, which shows him and one of his coworkers holding up their fists and voicing their support for their union's decision to continue their strike in defiance of a court order, though of course this did not turn out well for them in the long run. For years following Grace and Gracie's disappearances, Michael went all out with trying to keep up the illusion that they had disappeared voluntarily by continually writing letters to Grace's family in which he expressed his hope that they would return someday. But of course, he had a much darker side behind closed doors as he abused his second wife, Donna Rusin, and it sounds like she came dangerously close to suffering the same fate as Grace before she divorced him. It appears that the big mystery in this case is not so much what happened, but what Michael did with Grace and Gracie's bodies. It sounds like Grace's family remained convinced that their bodies are still located somewhere on the 10-acre plot of land in Jericho, Vermont, where the Reapps lived in 1978, though it has been searched no less than 25 times by law enforcement and they found nothing. After they performed their 3-day search in 1996, law enforcement seemed inclined to believe that the remains were not there, but they have not completely discounted the idea, particularly since it is surrounded by a large wooded area. During one interview, Brian expressed his belief that Grace and Gracie's remains were on the property, as the crime likely took place while he and his brother were at school, which only would have given Michael a few hours to hide the bodies before the kids arrived home. However, that doesn't preclude the idea of Michael only hiding the bodies there temporarily and then moving them to another location at a later time. After all, he did not actually contact the police to report Grace and Gracie missing until 5 days after they disappeared, so he definitely had ample time to cover his tracks, particularly since a full-fledged homicide investigation was not performed for several years. Well, the one thing which makes me inclined to believe that Grace and Gracie are still there is the fact that Michael decided to flee his residence in Jupiter, Florida in 1996 and made a failed attempt to get out of the country before he ultimately took his own life. To recap, when the investigation was rejuvenated that year, the Vermont State Police traveled down to Jupiter to interview Michael, and he continued to stick to the narrative that Grace and Gracie ran away and might still be alive somewhere. The authorities made sure not to tell Michael that they were going to perform another search of the property in Jericho, but when a reporter leaked that information to Michael during a phone call, well, lo and behold, he fled the state just a few days later. I have to think that if the remains were at another location, and Michael knew that nothing would be found on the property, he wouldn't have panicked like that. Remember, he had not actually been charged with any crime, and the murder indictments were not handed down against him until a full decade later. If Michael had remained in Florida, he would have been able to just keep on living his life like normal for a while, but it definitely seems like he felt the walls were closing in on him, and the authorities were going to find something which would lead to his arrest. Obviously, Michael must not have felt that he disposed of Grace and Gracie's remains so thoroughly that he believed they would never be found. So the other big complication here is the whole side story involving the arrest of Michael's father, Benjamin Reapp, for the murder of his own wife, Wanda Reapp. It's pretty remarkable that we have two members of the same family who were indicted for murdering their respective spouses in different states 10 years apart, but neither of them lived to stand trial. The outcome of this crime was a pretty big shocker, because if you comb through the newspaper archives and see the original media coverage from August of 1988, they contain a number of quotes from people who have nothing but good things to say about both Wanda and Benjamin, as one of their neighbors described them as, quote-unquote, the nicest couple you'd ever want to meet. There's no indication that they had any serious problems in their marriage, or that Benjamin was considered to be a suspect at that time. These articles also feature a composite sketch of the mysterious, unidentified black man who supposedly carjacked, raped, and murdered Wanda, but it now seems obvious that this man never existed, and Benjamin wound up foreshadowing one of the most infamous spousal murders of all time. You're probably familiar with the murder of Carol Stewart, a pregnant woman who was shot to death in Boston in October of 1989 after her husband, Charles Stewart, claimed that they were carjacked by an unidentified black man who shot both his wife and himself. But as I'm sure you know, it turned out that the whole scene was staged, and Carol was actually murdered by Charles, who took his own life before he could be arrested. It's crazy how Benjamin essentially committed the exact same crime over 1 year earlier, but it didn't get nearly as much coverage as the Stewart case, and Benjamin got away with it for much longer. Given that they had been married for nearly 30 years, I wondered why Benjamin would feel the need to kill Wanda, but from what I've heard, the crime was financially motivated as well. It's unclear when exactly investigators became suspicious of Benjamin and figured out he was the perpetrator, but by the time he was finally indicted in 2013, he was already serving time in prison for child molestation, so I guess the authorities figured they would take a shot at ensuring he never got released. Since Benjamin died before he could stand trial, we may never know the full extent of the evidence against him, but what I find most interesting is the cryptic statement from the lead agent on the case, Joe Martin, about how he felt someone else was likely involved in the crime, as Benjamin apparently said something about this to a key prosecution witness. Benjamin's story was that he was tied up by his so-called attacker before he was knocked unconscious with a blow to the head, and the attacker then forced Wanda to drive their car away from the scene, and he murdered her before tossing her body into a drainage ditch. Benjamin then ran to a nearby house and got the resident to untie him before he called 911. It's unclear if investigators verified if Benjamin had any injuries from the blow to the head, but if he did, it seems obvious that someone else would have needed to hit him as well as tie him up. Benjamin's car was also found abandoned about 8 miles from the attack scene, so I'm sure an accomplice would have needed to drive it there. And well, given the circumstances, who would be a more likely candidate to assist Benjamin with a crime like this than his own son? I have no idea what Benjamin's views were on the disappearances of Grace and Gracie, but if he believed that Michael killed them and was capable of murder, he could have enlisted his help. And even if Michael drew the line at harming his own mother, he may not have had any qualms about killing his stepmother, though if he actually went through with sexually assaulting Wanda, that's pretty repulsive. By the time Benjamin was indicted, Michael was already deceased, but if this case had gone to trial, it would have been interesting to see if the authorities pushed forward a scenario about father and son committing the crime together. Look, this is all just speculation, as law enforcement has never openly said anything about Michael being involved in Wanda's murder, but both he and his father were living in Florida in 1988, so that idea is feasible. And after Joe Martin pushed forward the possibility that Benjamin had assistance, he then said the line, quote, "and we may never know." That statement could very well be translated to, "we have our suspicions about who helped, but because he's dead, there's nothing more we can do, so this investigation is officially closed." So if father and son were both involved in Wanda's murder, I guess this opens up the question about whether Benjamin could have helped Michael cover up the murders of Grace and Gracie. Well, I had my doubts about that since they both went missing in Vermont, and I believe Benjamin was still living in Florida in 1978. Once again, I'd be really curious to know if Benjamin suspected his son and figured he was capable of assisting him with his own murder, but even though Benjamin was 87 years old at the time he was indicted, he still never admitted any culpability in his wife's murder before he died. So if he knew anything incriminating about Michael's crime, such as the location of Grace and Gracie's remains, he took that information to his grave. So there's nothing else I can really say about this story besides the fact that it seems pretty cut and dried that Michael Reapp was responsible for the disappearances of Grace and Gracie Reapp, and while killing his own wife was bad enough, the fact that he likely killed his own 5-year-old daughter just for being a witness makes him a true monster. Much like the Pam Page disappearance, this case might not have even qualified as an unsolved mystery or a case to be featured on The Trail Went Cold if the prime suspect had lived long enough to go on trial. While there are definitely some unanswered questions about Wanda's murder, at least there was a body in her case which could be laid to rest. This is not the case with Grace or Gracie, which is why their loved ones will continue to seek answers about what happened. I still think there's a chance the remains are somewhere on that 10-acre plot of land in Jericho, but I think it's just a matter of figuring out where to look. Perhaps there's someone out there who knows something, so if you happen to have any information about the disappearances of Grace and Gracie Reapp, please contact the Vermont State Police at 802-524-5993. That's 802-524-5993. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available on our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about Robert Weeks, a serial killer who was believed to be responsible for the murders of at least 4 victims whose remains were never found, and he has the distinction of being the subject of the very first case from Unsolved Mysteries to ever be solved. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, travel to the United Kingdom to discuss the unexplained 1976 death of Peter Watts, who was killed under mysterious circumstances after making a trip from his hometown in Wales to London. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I just want to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.